Okay, now I want to talk about body systems in general and then a couple specifically. And the specific ones here will be the skeletal and muscular system. We won't worry about the integumentary system. And so, as you probably know, there are different tissues inside of our bodies, and a tissue is a cluster of cells that have a particular job. And of course, we have muscle tissue that we'll look at in more detail. We have muscle of three basic types. There's the skeletal muscle, which is attached to our bones, and these are in control of voluntary movements, things you consciously think of. Then we have smooth muscle, and this is muscle that basically surrounds our digestive tract from the esophagus to the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And the job of this muscle is to sort of squeeze those passageways and keep things moving through the system. Then we have cardiac muscle, which, as the name suggests, is the heart, and both the smooth and the cardiac are involuntary. As you can imagine, you don't have to think about those things, which is good. We also have nerve tissue, which we won't be studying in detail, but we'll just know that nerve tissue is involved with receiving and sending signals around the body through the neurons, the neuron being the basic unit of the nervous system. Don't worry about all these terms on the neuron. Epithelial tissue, these are tissues that are the covering of the body, the skin basically, and the passageways inside your body that are connected to the outside. So your mouth and nose and esophagus and stomach and small and large intestine are lined with epithelial tissue. Anything that's on the outside or connected to the outside of your body is lined with epithelial tissue. And as you can imagine, there are different jobs. Excuse me. The skin is supposed to serve as a protective barrier to keep things out, whereas, say, your lungs are lined with a thin layer of cells of epithelial tissue whose job is to facilitate gas exchange. And in the intestine, the job is to absorb nutrients. So the job of the epithelial tissue can vary depending on where it is. We also have connective tissues. This is a rather busy picture here, but we'll just know that connective tissue is what holds things together inside your body, ligaments and tendons. It's also your skeletal system. Includes the blood, which is produced inside your bone marrow. Includes the fat tissue, or what's known as adipose tissue, that is used to store energy and also provides padding and for your body. And okay. Now, your body has several cavities or openings, and these openings, there's the cranial cavity, which has your brain and spinal column, the thoracic cavity, which has your lungs and heart, and the abdominal cavity, which has many of the other organs, kidney, stomach, liver, pancreas, intestines, bladder. And you can see that there's this muscle called the diaphragm that separates those two cavities. We'll see later how the diaphragm is involved with helping you breathe. Now, these cavities are not open. They are open spaces, but they're full of stuff, as you can imagine. It's not just these big open spaces inside of you, except for maybe your lungs. All right. The bones. We're going to be remembering some of the bones, the ones that are inside in your book, which is a subset of these. You don't have to know all of these, but we're going to have to know some of these. We'll go through them in class and label the ones we need to know. We also want to know a little bit about the structure of bones. Most bone consists of what's called compact bone, which is very densely packed bone, consisting of these things called Haversian canals, which are these circular units of bone that have an opening in them that have blood vessels running through them. Larger bones, what are sometimes called the long bones, your femur being a good example, your thigh bone, also have some spongy bone. You can see there's openings in there and it's full of bone marrow. Bone marrow is where you produce new blood cells. You have a membrane that surrounds the bone called the perosteum, and you have blood vessels that surround the bone and run into the bone, supplying it with blood, with nutrients and oxygen and such. When you see bone, of course it's from a dead organism, and so the bone is relatively dry because it's no longer alive. But bone is a living system within you, and it's not dry when it's inside of you, functioning, doing its job. All right, bone starts as cartilage, and then it hardens by having calcium deposited in it, and this is a process known as ossification. So when bones ossify, they go from being sort of somewhat flexible and cartilage-like to having a lot of calcium in them and becoming more rigid. Bones grow at the ends. So, for example, your femur, more cartilage is deposited at the end, and the bone can slowly get longer and longer. All right, where bones come together, you have joints. And one type of joint is known as a fixed joint, and your skull is a good example of this, where you have different bones that make up your skull, but where they meet, those joints are fixed. They do not move. But then others move, of course, like your elbow, which is known as a hinge joint. It moves on a single plane, like a hinge. Ball and socket, your hip and your shoulder. This is one of the more flexible joints. You're able to move it around in, of course, many directions. Pivot joint, the radius, which is one of the bones in your lower arm, is a good example of this. So it allows you to rotate or pivot your lower arm. Essentially, the radius pivots against the humerus. Glide joints are ones like in your feet and your hands. And so in the palm of your hand, essentially, you have a bunch of bones in there, and they are able to sort of slide or glide past each other a little bit, which makes your hand and your foot sort of somewhat flexible. Saddle joint, that's your thumb, which has a similar range of motion as a ball and socket, but the way the bones fit together is a little different. Okay, again, joints are where bones come together, and there's usually a lot happening at these joints. You have a lot of connective tissue that holds the joints together, and these are the ligaments. You'll have a meniscus, a disc that's in between the joints that keeps the bone from sort of coming together, padding, if you will. You also have tendons, which hold muscle to the bone at the joints. You've probably heard of an ACL. That's the anterior cruciate ligament. It's one of the main ligaments in the knee, and it's one that's often injured in athletic accidents, injuries. All right, there's also a subset of these muscles that we're going to want to know. It's in the book. We'll go through it. We also want to know what bone is made of. I'll come back to this slide in a second. The basic unit, muscle. We want to know what muscle is made of. It's made of proteins. For the most part, the basic unit is what's called a sarcomere. And here's our sarcomere, and it consists of these different protein fibers, what are known as myosin and actin. And so when muscles contract or get shorter, what happens is the sarcomere comes together. It gets shorter. So here's our sarcomere. And what happens is the actin slides across the myosin, causing the sarcomere to get shorter. And when a muscle relaxes, it gets longer. And so what happens is you have in what's called a myofibril, you have a bunch of these sarcomeres, one after the other. And so that whole myofibril gets shorter as each of those sarcomeres is contracting and getting shorter. The myofibrils are clustered into what are called muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are bundled into what are called bundles of muscle fibers, and then when you take a bunch of bundles, you have a muscle. And so this whole muscle is going to have a whole lot of these sarcomeres. And when your muscle contracts, again, they're all getting shorter, and the muscle sort of bulges out as it's getting shorter. And then the sarcomeres get longer when that muscle relaxes. It takes energy, of course, a lot of ATP for these muscles to contract. And these proteins kind of move along each other as the ATP is supplied and the contraction occurs. The voluntary muscles we have, the ones that are connected to joints, operate in opposition to each other. So, for example, your elbow. You have the biceps brachii, which is the one that causes the joint to bend or flex. And so that muscle would be known as a flexor because it flexes the joint. The triceps brachii on the back side of your arm, upper arm, is what causes that joint to extend out. So it's an extensor. So you have flexors that bend the joint and extensors that straighten out the joint. And again, they work in opposition to each other. And these are some guys that have been supplementing their muscles using anabolic steroids. Steroids are great when used properly, but they can be overused and abused, and that's not a good thing. Okay, we're not going to worry about the integumentary system other than to know it's an example. Your skin is an example of epithelial tissue that covers the body.